You're here in the stillness. Near me, I sense holy sweetness, calling my soul. Oh, it's restless and running my soul. Oh, it's restless till I find my rest in thee.
Well, hello, I am Father Nick, the priest and pastor of the Fort Church of St. Martin's Parish in Doswell, Virginia. And for the second week in a row now, I have with me the Reverend Justin McIntosh. Justin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, yes. So I'm Father Justin. I'm from St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Ivy, which is just a suburb of Charlottesville. And delighted to be with you again, Nick, for our conversations.
Great. Yeah. And what we're talking about, and this was really Justin's idea. He contacted me a few months ago and suggested that we do, get together and do this series. We're talking about being secular being Christian in secular age, which
Right.
might be being secular also, but being Christian in a secular age. And I've kind of added onto that title, being Christian in a secular age, a pilgrimage. And we mentioned why I thought that was important in our first video. So if you haven't watched that, we encourage you to go and check that video out first, and then come back and join us for this conversation, because we're building. Each video is going to build on the previous videos, and so it's really important that you get that background, or it might not be clear what we're talking about and why we're using certain terms and referring to certain scholars. But Justin, last week we talked about mapping the secular. Why don't you introduce our topic for this session?
Sure. So we've mapped the secular, we've laid out the terrain, what the different features are of our secular age that we live in. Today, we're going to look at the story or stories of how we got here, the popular narratives of how we came to live in this secular age. We're going to walk you through that.
Yeah, and before we even do that, though, before we go on that journey, let's take a glance back down at the map that we drew out or unfolded in the discussion last time, and just kind of remind you and remind each other of what we kind of, some of the broad strokes of that map. Maybe the first thing to talk about is a phrase that Justin used, I think in that video, certainly in our Wednesday night discussion several times, a phrase that he and I have gotten from Charles Taylor, who is perhaps our most important guide in this discussion. Charles Taylor, and as we said last week, James K.A. Smith, these two philosophers are perhaps our two most important guides on this journey. And one of these phrases that we've picked up from Taylor is the immanent frame. And Justin, I'll say a little bit about that, but maybe you can start us off. And when you were using that term and borrowing it from Taylor, how were you using it? What does Taylor mean by the immanent frame?
My understanding is that Taylor sees the immanent frame as essentially the material, physical world. And to speak of it as a frame is to envision that world as closed, right? You frame something, you kind of close it around. So it is not a world in which the transcendent is mixed in or meshed or integrated with the material or the physical, but the physical and the material is all there is, and it's framed, it's enclosed.
That's right. So when you speak of something like the transcendent, you don't necessarily have to mean God, but that's often
Right.
what people mean. Uh,
Right.
and the idea is that anything that transcends that immanent frame, or anything that transcends the categories of a materialist conception of reality,
Right.
uh, that is beyond the frame. If you live in the immanent frame, as Taylor suggests we in a secular age all do,
Right.
you can believe that there's something beyond the frame. You
Right.
can certainly believe that, and we'll talk more about that in later sessions. But you can't expect others to believe it.
Right.
It's your personal
And there
belief.
and there is a sense, Nick, and I think this is the difference. There's a spatial sense when you're talking about the immanent frame. One might almost think of it as a sphere, all right, that's enclosed. And if you are religious in a secular age, you might have holes or gaps in the sphere in which outside of it, God or the transcendent or the divine is able to break in some ways. But you see, the very conception, the image that we're using here, privileges a kind of closed immanent frame, a closed world. And this is not the only way that one could look at reality. It's not the way that people looked at reality before a secular age. Um, but it is kind of the guiding, underlying perspective that we all have, whether we realize it or not. I think that's the key point.
Yeah, that's right. It's the the agreed upon reality that we all buy into, which is just this map. It just is the map of the secular. It just is this description of the universe that we get from science, but not just from science. I mean, science only kind of sets some of the stage for that story, but there's more, and that's part of what we'll be talking about, is that
Right.
the frame is um, is bounded by not just scientific knowledge, but also assumptions about the nature of reality. And one way to think about this, though, is, you know, we talk about the fact that there's a whole lot that science doesn't actually know. Uh, it, you know, the body of knowledge produced by science is impressive.
Mm.
There's no questioning of that. And Justin and I are not anti-science in any way. But if you talk to, say, cosmologists, what we actually know is very limited, and there's a whole lot that we don't know. And the assumption is that we just don't know it because we haven't built up our scientific knowledge enough yet. If we just
Right.
build a larger, version of the Hadron Collider, if we just build another, they're talking about building one on the moon now, right? Because you need that. If you just build it bigger, then you'll learn more, and eventually, you know, like. You know, as we'll see in a sense in the stories of the secular, you know, perhaps you heard this story when you were a kid that, all through the medieval period, the Middle Ages, everybody believed the earth was flat, and
Mm.
that if you sailed too far, then you would sail off.
Off the edge of the map, yes.
Uh,
Yes.
and then and then you had the age of discovery, and you had Columbus and such, and they sailed, and they went, and eventually sailed around the world, and they found that it's not flat, it's a sphere, and so on. which we don't need to get into it, but that's not a real story. I mean, that's not true, right?
Right, right.
But that's a story that I remember hearing as a child, and Justin,
Sure.
I wonder if you did too.
I think at some point in high school, some history teacher said that wasn't true, but they had to say that because when we were younger,
Right,
that's what we heard, right?
right.
That was just in the culture. That was the popular narrative, if you will.
That's right. Yeah. And so that, just as in that story, we kind of have this view that science may not explain everything, but that's just because we haven't sailed far enough.
Right.
And that there is no edge. Eventually, science will provide for us a complete picture of reality, and therefore, everything that science can eventually explain and describe is reality. That's what's real. And therefore, reality is defined by whatever science can explain or describe. That's the immanent frame.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
and
It assumes that there is no more to reality than simply the physical. And of course, by definition, science is only studying the physical. Science can't speak about anything that is a non-material reality or not energy or whatever. And if you operate with that assumption, that's fine as you're doing science, right? The problem, I suppose, becomes when you assume that that is then all there is to reality. We talked in the last video about kind of a flat world, right? And by that we simply mean a world that is simply the immanent frame, just the material, just the physical, has none of that multidimensional character that the world possessed before 1500, before a secular age. And these, again, are not scientific questions ultimately. These are metaphysical or philosophical questions. It's how you frame things at the most ultimate level. And we haven't learned anything scientifically in the last 500 plus years that necessitates that one believe in the flattened universe versus a multi-layered cosmos. There's just simply nothing scientifically that necessitates that view. That's a philosophical choice that a person makes.
right. And even in that way that you just worded it, I think is interesting. A
Mm,
philosophical choice that a person makes, but in some sense it's not. I mean, that's part of the next thing.
right,
Move from imminent frame here in a
right,
second. But in some ways that's the story that we inherit, less so than a position we adopt. Although some people do
sure.
intentionally adopt that position, and some people do intentionally reject it. But that moves us to the other half of this map, which is what Taylor calls exclusive humanism.
Mhm.
And you don't need to hear that as necessarily negative, by the way, which I think maybe some who are come from religious backgrounds might. Uh,
Mhm.
what that mostly means is that we now live in a world, in an age, in this imminent frame where the expectation is that we make the decisions about what we believe and what we don't believe, what we imbue with meaning and what we don't imbue with meaning, that it's
Right,
not received, but it's created by us,
right.
and that it depends on us, you
Right.
know. um, I heard a great example of this is, and I forget the author's name now, but the author of the book *Sapiens*. Are you
Oh yes,
familiar with this?
Yuval Yuri, the Israeli author.
Right,
Yeah,
that's
can't
right.
remember his name.
Yeah,
It'll come to me.
and he has he has a way of describing, for example, how money takes on meaning, and his point is that, oh, this is just a piece of paper, and a piece of green paper. Why should it have any value or mean anything? Well, he says, you know because you tell me it means something and I believe you, and so we imbue this thing with meaning. And that you think about it and you think, oh, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because why would a piece of green paper, you know, have any value compared to actual commodities like food or you know,
I
or
mean, this is one of the first lessons you learn in microeconomics is,
right.
that anything can serve as a currency.
Right.
Yep.
But then if you stop and you think about it a little bit further, and I don't want to get too far down this road. When did you decide that money has value? When did you make that
Oh,
decision
yeah,
for
yeah,
yourself? Right. And
yeah,
and what would happen if you decided that it didn't?
right.
Right? Could
Yeah,
you
I think
really opt out of that? You know?
no,
Uh,
you can't. Not if you're living in a society. And I think that's the key distinction maybe we want to make here is that at some level, Taylor, I think, would say this is at the heart of his book in a way. Every age has a social imaginary, right? Which is a kind of philosophical or metaphysical interpretation of reality. Taylor wants to make that point very clear. What's I think you're getting at, Nick, and what's so important about the social imaginary, the kind of background frame of our time of a secular age, is that one of the assumptions of that is that every person has to make their own meaning, has to find their own way, has to construct reality for themselves to be authentic, right? If you don't do that, if you don't construct your reality for yourself, in some sense, you are not being authentic. If you simply follow the tradition or what has been passed on to you, and I think you're very helpfully pointing out that in many ways, in fact, we all do this. So by the definition of our current social imaginary, we're all inauthentic, right? Because we just buy into things all the time, whether it's money or whatever, uncritically, because that is just the structure of meaning that we've been given by our society.
right. And as you said though, part of exclusive humanism in this desire for authenticity is we have to at least find ways to tell ourselves that we've actually made a decision about these things. I mentioned him last time. I'll mention him again. But the theologian Stanley Hauerwas, or Christian ethicist theologian Stanley Hauerwas, has said that modernity names the story that you have no story except the story you chose when you had no story. That's the way he says it, which is a little bit of a tongue twister.
And it's rooted in one of the features of modernity or a secular age, that there is no objective reality, right? That's lurking there in the background. That at the end of the day, people make their own choices. People have their own values, their own norms, and you've got to do what speaks to you, what is authentic to you. Um, Taylor in his book, and we won't want to get into too much depth about this, but has interesting reflections on advertisement and marketing, and the ways in which those things shape our values and desires, and therefore problematize this whole notion of authenticity. What does it really mean to know what your desires are, your true ultimate desires, and to serve those? So I think that's part of it too, is that the notion that there is a kind of shared absolute or objective foundation that we all participate in, and are trying to understand and learn from, that's not part of our social imaginary.
Yeah, I mean it is and it isn't,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean, it is insofar as we all assume the materialistic world
right, right,
explored
right,
by science. It's
right.
not in terms of any questions beyond that. Then it all
Yes, let's say
becomes,
ethics, significance, meaning, value. That's a good point. Yeah, yeah.
um, you you know, maybe we need to go ahead and stop there, look up from the map, and start the journey because
Hmm.
um, one thing is I hear Justin and I are both kind of um, straining against the straitjacket of this description, and we want to start critiquing it and talking about what's problematic about it. But what we've told each other we're going to wait and
Thank
say,
you for reining us back in, Nick. Yes.
so what we really want to do now is turn to those stories that are underlying and in some sense creating this social imaginary that is the foundation of our map with its immanent frame and its exclusive humanism. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into what Taylor calls the master narratives, or what Jean-Francois Lyotard, usually his work, it's translated as the meta narratives, which is just another way of saying master narratives, right? The kind of overarching narratives that, you know, kind of undergird and orient us in this secular age. So what I'm going to say now, it just kind of in as a kind of preface, is the story that we're going to tell, the history we're going to review. We know, if you're a historian and you're watching, you might say, well, this is problematic. You know, this is we know, we understand. What we want to do is tell the story as you have probably heard it, the kind of popular level stories that still animate some of the thinking, both academically and popularly, about how we got here, how we got to this modern secular age. We understand that there's problems, and we'll talk about those problems in later videos, but the story as we tell it should sound familiar. Just like the map that we said last week, the map should, as we're describing it, feel familiar to you. This story should sound familiar. This should sound something like the story you've picked up from school, from your parents, from reading the newspaper, from watching TV. This should sound like the basic narrative of history that you have heard, particularly Western history, that you have heard throughout your life. And we're not going to critique it right now. We just want to tell the story as it is. Justin, did you have anything to say about that before I get started?
No, I think that's exactly right. And let's get into it.
Right. So we have to jump all the way back to 500 BC, or just about that time. Right around 500, we've got the age of the pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece. This is right around what some historians have called the axial age. And from about 500 BC to 500 CE, or Common Era, which if you're not familiar with that terminology, historians now like to use CE rather than AD. So they typically use BCE and CE, before the Common Era, and the Common Era, instead of the more traditional BC is before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. To kind of take it out of its Christian context. Another example of secularization, in a sense. Let's move it into a realm. Our discussion of history, let's move it into a realm that's not confessionally defined by one's faith confession. Let's talk about time. It's still the same division of time, based on the birth of Christ, but we're no longer going to use the language of the birth of Christ as being the dividing point in history. So 500 BC to 500 CE, or AD 500, what we typically hear about this time period, starting with the pre-Socratics, and then Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then this age of antiquity, is that this was a time in which humanity made its first tentative steps towards throwing off mythology, throwing off superstition, and moving towards reason and moving towards a more kind of scientific perspective. So, often lifted up from this time period are those philosophers who question the existence of the gods. You know, Inevitably, there's talk about Democritus, who nobody seems to know anything about besides the fact that he posited that everything was made up of very tiny particles called atoms, and the rest of his philosophy gets forgotten.
And interesting to note too that his conception of atoms has absolutely nothing to do really with the modern conception of atoms too. But he's sometimes seen in this story, right, as being somebody who said the same thing. But
right, a precursor, yeah. We get during this period the observation of nature, and you can see this in Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle was a great taxonomist. And the prizing of reason as a goal and an endeavor of humanity. So that's antiquity in this story, or the ancient world. But unfortunately, as Gibbon described in his The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, we had the rise of Christianity coming out of the eastern part of the empire, and with it came the fall of the Roman Empire. Well, at least Western Roman Empire, right? But typically, in the way that this gets told, it's just said the Roman Empire. In fact, the Eastern Empire continued for quite some time after that. And so we begin to see a turn, usually in this description of the rise of Christianity and the fall of the Roman Empire, and therefore the end of antiquity. Often you get descriptions of Saint Augustine as this, this saint who thought, bodies and human sexuality were terrible, and gave us therefore repressive ideas about human sexuality and bodies in general, and also gave us the beginnings of ideas like predestination, which must clearly be wrong, and so on. And so in some tellings, not all, but in some tellings, Augustine often becomes a villain in these. We also hear about
the transition, right, from late antiquity into the Middle Ages, a harbinger of all the terrible things that are to come, and a suppression of the Greek and Latin wisdom and philosophy and literature that was really kicked off by the pre-Socratics and Socrates. That all gets lost, buried, as urban life declines and society crumbles. Civilization, I think we ought to use that word. Civilization disappears.
Right. And the great, the great example of this that's lifted up is the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the great Library of Alexandria, this place that housed the texts, all the texts of ancient learning. And sometimes connected with that is the story of the murder of the pagan philosopher Hypatia, who was a woman and Neoplatonist in the line of Plotinus, so his form of Neoplatonism, who was a teacher in Alexandria, who was in fact murdered by a group of Christians, lay Christians. The story is complex, but that's the way. Often that complex story is simply told as Hypatia was this great scientific, mathematical thinker in the pagan tradition who gets murdered by these, Christians as they're destroying the library in Alexandria. And you can see a version of that in as I've just told it in the movie Agora, where Rachel Weisz plays Hypatia. And
And it seems, Nick,
go ahead.
maybe as well, that we could add to that, that there's a kind of oppression of women as well, right? You have this woman who is really flourishing and successful and intellectual and scientific, and Christianity, which is anti-woman in this telling, is suppressing that, extinguishing that light.
That's right, yeah, and that definitely comes out in this movie Agora also. So I mean, that movie is a great example of the way that story gets told.
Yeah.
And again, all of these stories we'll come back to in a later video to talk about them with a little more depth. But right now, we're just trying to give the overview of how these stories get told, and that tends to be part of the example of the decline or the collapse of civilization, and this turn from antiquity to this period of time that we sometimes call the Middle Ages or the medieval period or the Dark Ages. And I remember, one of my history teachers when I was in high school, I guess I was a sophomore in high school, and her describing some of this as part of the lesson that we learned, and how perhaps she had read that perhaps a series of comets streaking across the sky, being interpreted as dragons, was part of the kind of this turn from the the learning and knowledge of antiquity to this kind of regression and fall into the Dark Ages, which is often spoken of as a time of both the church and of superstition, where so in this view, it's a time when people believed in all sorts of things like fairies and witches and demons, and they feared these things: demons, witches, hell, and had all of these superstitious beliefs, and believed in magic, for example, and the church in this telling of the story exploited that fear, that especially that fear of hell, but even those superstitious fears, exploited that fear to gain religious and sociocultural and even political power, so that we're often told that during this time when the church had when reason had fallen away and we're no longer in an age of reason but in an age of faith, it was also a time when the church dominated both cultural life and political life, and the church's power was built on the fear that the people had of hell and of demons, of witches, and therefore the church required that people be ignorant if they were to continue in their fear, which was the basis of the church's power. So the church was invested in no new knowledge, no new scientific discoveries, no new exploration of the world. Instead, you just want people on their knees praying and otherwise, out in the fields working.
Because Christianity is self-evidently wrong, right? It's superstitious. It rests on no sturdy knowledge, and so the only way it can be kept at work and kept as a foundational element of the society is for people to be kept in stupidity, or let's even put it this way, in childish ignorance. And in a sense, then people are kind of enslaved, right? Intellectually, spiritually, if you will, enslaved. And within them, there is a yearning to know, to understand reality. Reason wants to come out and flourish, but the church is keeping it boxed in chains, all right, enslaved in that sense.
And you don't even need a villain for this, by the way. I mean, because nobody's saying that the church, that the leadership of the church knew science and and reason and stuff, but kept it from people. Everybody was in ignorance and darkness,
Right.
but the church was invested in maintaining that,
Right.
with without having to have a conspiracy or a villain,
Right.
simply by the power of the institution needing to being undergirded by that ignorance, that, as you
Right.
said, childish kind of ignorance of everybody.
Right.
So that, again, this is the way the story tends to get told, and it's not as if there aren't some romantic elements of this. This is a time of knights in shining armor and
Chivalry and yeah.
you know, but these are also the same knights who will eventually go off to the Crusades, which is a part of the story is to raise up the Crusades as a great example of the church trying to extend its power and its influence. And the Inquisition is the church trying to stamp down any kind of bubbling up of new knowledge or exploration or ideas that go beyond the dogma. So that's kind of our way of understanding the Dark Ages, as it's often called, or the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, which lasts from about 500 to 1500. So another millennia, or
Long time to be in the dark, Nick.
yeah, another 1,000-year period.
Yeah.
And then, and we mentioned this last time in our last video, then we have this breaking of the dawn into the gloom of the night of the Dark Ages. We have the beginning of modernity, or the modern age, right around 1500. And this is comes about because of the rise of humanism, which is begins in that 15th century, so in the 1400s, with it is often described as being a time of going back to the sources, but also getting some, kind of recovering some of that ancient learning. And so this brings about what's sometimes called the Renaissance, or if I wanted to be pretentious, I could say the Renaissance. And
Which literally means rebirth,
right?
right? That's an important thing to point out. This is a rebirthing of the wisdom of the ancient world that has been lost. That in a sense, history, the development of history towards wisdom and understanding and knowledge has stopped in 500, we'll say, and is now starting up again. It's being energized, reborn.
And we should say, just for really quickly, humanism gets its name not because of a focus on humans, like it will come to be, focus on the subjective individual self, the buffered self, the authentic self, that exclusive humanism will describe. But this older form of humanism gets its name from the humanities, what's being taught in the well, they're not really new at that point. They're several hundred years old, but at the universities, the kind of literature that's being read, Cicero and so on. We can talk more about that next time, I think. But we have this rediscovery of the ancient learning, the science and reason of antiquity, and this can't help but spur on questions, lead to questions about the church and about the church's traditions and about dogma, and it spurs on discoveries, new discoveries in science. And in the light of this, you know, that magic and that superstition begin to dissipate, you know, in this dawning light of reason and science.
Yeah.
And you know, the names that are often connected with this, first Nicholas Copernicus, who was lived from 1473 to 1543. You know, oftentimes you'll hear about the Copernican revolution. You know, the church in its ignorance, you know, spoke of the earth as a center of creation because, you know, that's what Genesis says. So the earth is the center of the universe, the center of the cosmos, and everything, including the sun and the moon and the stars, you know, the firmament above, rotates around the earth, but the earth is fixed and flat, right? Fixed and flat. But Copernicus comes along and says, no, the sun is at the center, the heliocentric view of the universe. And then Galileo, not long after him, Galileo Galilei, whose dates are 1564 to 1642, you know, he does the, you know, he's able to do the astronomy that supports Copernicus, and he pushes us forward even more. And this story, the story of Galileo, often, you know, comes in a big way in this story of the secular, the emergence of the secular, because Galileo is seen as a scientist who is persecuted by the church,
Right.
because of his commitment to science and reason and evidence, and making inferences from evidence and from the testing of hypotheses. And the church wants us to remain ignorant again. Once, you know, the only source of truth is scripture, and, you know, and what the Pope says. And so therefore you know, it doesn't matter what you see, what you observe empirically, and what you test, and the hypotheses that you test. That doesn't matter if scripture says it, and therefore Galileo is persecuted by the church. And Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I've seen it, but doesn't this story even get told in the most recent, not Carl Sagan's original series Cosmos, but the more recent one?
Yes, that's right. Neil deGrasse Tyson, I believe, recounts the story of Galileo in the terms, Nick, that you've just used, as a conflict between church and religion, or science and religion. There's a sense in which, as we've been saying, the church or religion makes its decisions based only on tradition or on scripture, on some form of authority that is, in a sense, kind of oppressing the individual. And the growing up process involves thinking for yourself, involves breaking out of that tradition, that oppressive authority, and coming up with your own understanding of things. So Galileo, you know, he's got his telescopes, he sees Jupiter's moons, he sees things in a new way and says, well, the church has been wrong about all of this stuff. And he's presented, therefore, as a kind of heroic modern person who's standing against the forces of enslavement, intellectual enslavement.
Yeah, yeah. I think we'll definitely need to next time, in the next video, come back to that
Sure. Yeah.
and talk about that story and why it's so important in this narrative, and maybe look at some of its details. But we're not going to do that here. We're going to move on to the other thing that's happening at the same time as the rise of humanism and the Renaissance, and that is the Reformation, which happens at around the same time. The Reformation is often said to begin on October 31st in 1517, when the Augustinian Eremite, or that's it's an order that's kind of somewhere between a friar and a monk. But you all know him. His name was Martin Luther. He nailed or in some way posted up 95 theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, the University Church in Wittenberg in Germany, and electoral Saxony. And that hammering of the nail, if that's how it was done, if that's how it was posted up, was the sound of the first blows at the foundations of the medieval Catholic Church and its hegemony, its power over the culture and society and political arrangements. That's often how it's spoken of and talked about.
So progress is being made, Nick. I mean,
That's
we've
right.
really evolved here under this narrative over the last 1500 years. Things have gotten much better. We had that nice little birth in antiquity, but that was pretty much smothered. And then we have this rebirth, and the grip of the church is really loosening here, and things are starting to open up.
That's
Things are
right.
getting better.
And people are beginning to see that what the church's doctrine and dogma presented was perhaps just Catholic superstition,
Right.
to be replaced by true Protestant faith, at least for those who are of the Protestant fold. The example of this, and this comes from much later, but an example that strikes me of this difference between how this, beginning with the Reformation and then moving forward even to today, this idea of quote unquote Catholic superstition versus Protestant faith, seems to me is really clear in this one scene from the novel Dracula, which takes place quite a bit later. I mean, that takes place in the 1890s, so much closer to our own day. Although, as I forget we're in the 21st century, so maybe not quite as close as I'd like to think.
Right.
But it's a scene that shows up, though in slightly different ways, even in the movie versions of Dracula, because I think it strikes a little bit of a chord. I don't know if you all know the story, but at the very beginning of the story, and I think actually that whole novel is a great study in the secular age versus ancient magic and superstition, and how the two clash. So, whatever its literary merits or demerits, depending on who you talk to, it it's worth reading in light of, like, if you read Taylor's A Secular Age, or you read James K. Smith's How Not to Be Secular, and then go read Dracula, and read it from that perspective, and you can really see it as these two ages kind of clashing. And then you get an interesting character like Abraham Van Helsing, who seems to straddle both ages. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. What I really want to do is just focus you in on one scene early on in the novel, and that's when Jonathan Harker is who's this Englishman, works for a law firm. And he's traveling to Castle Dracula so that he can present Dracula with the documents pertaining to Dracula's purchase of several properties in England, and get his his signature and all that kind of stuff. And so Harker is heading there, and of course he doesn't know what he's getting himself into. But as he goes deeper into Eastern Europe, you get the sense that he's leaving enlightened civilization behind, and he's almost traveling back in time into kind of the
heart of darkness,
right, the darkness of the medieval period, and
right.
And the people therefore act in these superstitious ways. And when he explains that he's trying to get to Castle Dracula, one of these old peasant women try and give him a rosary. And so she's trying to force a rosary on him, and he wants to decline, he says, because he's a good, Englishman. He's a good churchman, that is a member of the Church of England, and he doesn't abide by such. And I wish I had the phrase off the top of my head, but something like, these kind of baubles of papal superstition or whatever, right? Because he certainly isn't going to pray this rosary, right? He doesn't, he may not even know the prayers that go along with a rosary. But the woman is trying to give him the rosary not as a tool for his prayer life, which is the way we might think of rosaries now, but as a sacramental, that it itself, because it's been blessed by a priest, because it has the crucifix on it, and the perhaps a miraculous medal or a medal of Mary on it, and, that it in its very kind of material existence is a conduit for supernatural power, even if he doesn't know how to use it.
Right.
And he doesn't want it because he doesn't believe in that.
Right.
He doesn't believe there's any supernatural evil that's going to assail him that he needs protection from, and he doesn't believe that even if there were some kind of evil that would assail him, that this piece of wood and metal is going to protect him in any
Right.
way.
He's rational, and he's an enlightened 19th century gentleman. He understands that science can explain everything in the world, that the world is mechanistic and orderly, and that these are superstitions that are holding back humanity, right?
Right.
These are the things of the past. It would be like going back to your childhood. Who would want to do that, right? You want to keep growing up.
Right. And notice too, he ties it to his Protestantism. I know a lot of Anglicans and Episcopalians don't like to think of ourselves as
Right.
Protestant these days, and that's another story for another time. But certainly, yeah, at the end of the 19th century, the majority of members of the Church of England and any Anglicans, with the exception of a small group known as the Oxford Movement or the Tractarians, everyone else thought of Anglicanism as Protestant. So he ties this enlightened view with its rejection of superstition to his Protestantism, and so we see that that's connected to the Reformation, which is what we were talking about. The other part of this is after the Reformation gets going, we really do see the collapse of the political power of the Roman Catholic Church in many places. I mean, in England. It's threatened in France, though it's able to retain until the French Revolution, retain its place of prominence in France. But for a time, and we'll talk about this maybe in a second, it wasn't clear that Catholicism was going to last in France. Scotland, it loses its hold on Scotland, the Netherlands, and so on. Anyway, certain parts of Germany, as as reformations are kind of popping up and spreading across Europe, the power of the Catholic Church is beginning to collapse, and in the vacuum of that collapse of the Church's power, we get the wars of religion, and there's wars of religion happening all over Europe, and these are seen as wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, and sometimes between the Protestants and the radical reformers like the Mennonites. Although after the siege of Munster, the Mennonites become, or the Anabaptists tend to become, I shouldn't just say Mennonites, Menno Simmons is the one who moves in the direction of pacifism, but Anabaptists in general move away from militancy and towards pacifism. But the point is, Catholics and Protestants are fighting each other in the Schmalkaldic Wars from 1546 through 1555, and the French Wars of religion between the Huguenots and the Catholics from 1562 to 1598, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, and the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. That's the one, of course, where Oliver Cromwell leads the Parliament and the parliamentary forces against the king, and actually engages in deicide, or not deicide, I'm sorry, but deicide is the killing of
Regicide.
God. Yeah, regnicide. Yeah. Anyway, so
Can't kill God, but yes.
although that's, we can talk about that as being part of.
We will. Well, Nick, I wonder if I can jump in here too. You mentioned Munster. I actually lived in Munster for a couple of months when I was in college, and my wife, girlfriend at the time, lived there for a whole year. And on the cathedral there in downtown Munster, they have these cages very high up where they put the leaders of the rebellion, the radical reformers. They put them in these cages high up on the cathedral so birds could come and kind of eat at them all day long. And those cages, if I'm remembering correctly, are still there. And as you're telling this story, it's reminding me that how that sort of narrative was being communicated just by that site, and the fact that the cages are still up there, almost to remind you, like, this is what happens when religion is in control of a society. It leads to these fanatical movements, it leads to conflict, it leads to barbarism. Look at these cages up there, as a sort of reminder to people, a way of communicating this narrative we're talking about.
Yeah, right. And that I mean, I think that moves us nicely along to what do you do when the religions are at war with each other? How do you deal with that? And the answer was the rise of the modern nation state, which came about, this movement again from monarchies and kingdoms and realms to nation states. They might still have some kind of monarch, but now the monarch has to work with parliament or whatever, and you have this clear bounded reality of we don't have the realm of the King of England, we have the nation state of England. And these nation states arise to put down warring religion, and so we get, for example, the Peace of Westphalia with its treaty that says "Cuius regio eius religio," or whose realm their religion. The religion of each realm or each area will be determined by its prince.
Right, right.
So the religion of the prince is a religion of his realm, his or her realm. Similarly, we see, for example, in Queen Elizabeth I or Queen Elizabeth Tudor, that she's often quoted as having said, I have no desire to make a window into men's souls, right? In terms of this question of whether or not they are true believers in the Church of England or whether or not they're secretly Roman Catholic. And her point was, you believe whatever you want, but you have to conform to the act of supremacy, that the monarch is, in charge of the Church of England, and the act of uniformity, that you'll go to church, and that church will be, if you're a clergy, you will conduct the liturgy of the church according to the Book of Common Prayer, which will include praying for the monarch, right? That's, and then if you want to believe that during the Eucharist, the bread and wine become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, that's fine. You believe that. If you want to believe that it's both bread and wine and the body and blood of Christ simultaneously, believe that. If you want to believe that it's just a symbol and a memorial meal and it doesn't actually become anything other than just remain bread and wine meant to remind us of Christ's sacrifice, you can believe that. I don't care. Your personal religious beliefs aren't important, but you have to hold to the act of supremacy and the act of uniformity. You will treat the monarch as the head of the church. Well, she didn't like the language of head of the church, but the one in charge of the Church of England, and you will go to church and pray for the good of the realm and the good of the monarch, according to the Book of Common Prayer.
And we're seeing here, I think, the beginnings of that spatial divide that we discussed last time, that defines a secular age, that is a key part of secularism, that there's a kind of private religious sphere. Yes, there's still very much a public religious life here. But I think, Nick, what you're saying very importantly is that your individual religious convictions and beliefs have been privatized in this system, because when you try to make those things public, what does it lead to? The view is, well, it just leads to nothing but violence, right? To quote Christopher Hitchens, religion poisons everything. So it leads to nothing but conflict and violence, and so you need to have a separation, and that's, in some ways, that's the role of the state, the role of the monarch or the government. And I think you see this playing out very clearly in social theorists such as Thomas Hobbes, right? And his idea of Leviathan as that which keeps the conflicting interests of society from destroying each other, and that people should focus on their common interests, and then questions about religion and all of that, that shouldn't be at all part of the public or the general social life, because that only leads to conflict. We see similar ideas developing in Locke, right, and others. And of course, for you and me, Nick, right, this is foundational for us as Americans, right? Because these ideas then get enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, especially. They become the kind of foundation for our own nation state and how we conceive of ourselves as a kind of antidote to the wars of religion, right? That this is what you want to do if you want to move beyond, grow up beyond that sort of darkness.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so in our discussion last Wednesday, the off the air discussion that we had with folks, of course Jefferson came up because Justin's parishioners were on there, and they live in Ivy and Charlottesville, so they're right around Mr. Jefferson's neighborhood. So Thomas Jefferson comes up, and interestingly, where I am at the Fort Church of St. Martin's Parish in Doswell, Virginia, we're right down the street from Scotchtown, which is where Patrick Henry lived. And one of the interesting things that you see is that when Virginia wanted to create its own constitution and set up its own state government, this question of religion came up. And should there be an established religion? So one of the things that people often don't realize is that the First Amendment for almost the first, well, not quite the first 100 years, but at least the first 50 to 75 years of this nation, the First Amendment was interpreted that the federal government could not establish a religion, but
state
governments could still do so, and many states, or at least some states, did, and did up into the 19th century. I think Congregationalism was the established religion of Massachusetts until the 1820s or 1830s. So the question was, would Virginia have any kind of established religion? And Patrick Henry said, well, how about this? We don't establish any one religion or one denomination of, say, Christianity, one form, whether Protestant or Catholic, or one of the various forms of Protestantism that had already, Protestantism almost from the beginning began to split into various different confessions, or what we might now call denominations. He said, let's not have one, we'll just establish religion as a genus level term, as we discussed last time. Religion itself will be established. And therefore, when you pay your taxes, you can indicate if there's a particular church that you want, or a particular confession you want your taxes to go to support it. And
interestingly, is pretty similar to what they have in Germany currently.
That's right.
So, you can indicate that you're a Protestant or a Catholic or something else, and your tax money will go towards that.
That's right. And so this is Patrick Henry's position. And Jefferson comes along and says, no, you're not understanding how important it is to, and Jefferson's the one who had used in his letter to the Baptists, he had said there needs to be a wall of separation. He says, you don't understand how important it is to maintain that wall of separation. And he wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It's actually the Virginia Statute establishing religious freedom, because he does this interesting thing where he uses religious language to say the established religion of Virginia is religious freedom. That's our religion. That's the religion that we're going to establish, is religious freedom, so that no particular religion gets enshrined. And the Catholic theologian, I think actually drawing on someone else, perhaps Michael Novak, but the Catholic theologian William Cavanaugh calls this the empty shrine. We're going to set up a shrine, but nothing's going to be in it. Which has, of course, connotations. It should remind you of the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Israel, right? Ptolemy goes in and sees that it's empty, and he's kind of haunted by this. But the emptiness is very different between the Holy of Holies in the temple in Israel, the Second Temple during the time of Jesus, and the emptiness of the empty shrine of religious freedom in America.
And yet, as you're saying, Nick, religious language, religious imagery is used to enshrine religious liberty. And in a way, it seems then that we're witnessing here the formation of kind of a civic religion. And you and I certainly hear this all the time. Religious language applied to American institutions, right? Um, Words like sacred or temple or shrine. Those are words that are thrown around all the time to refer to aspects of American society, and it seems that that flows very naturally from what Jefferson was saying here.
Yeah, I think so, and that's something I think we should definitely explore a little bit more of in one of the later videos. What I want to do now is turn just a little bit more away from this, the rise of the nation states to suppress religious violence, and talk about another aspect of modernity, which is the Enlightenment. Though maybe I'll stop for a second and say, we mentioned the age of discovery, as it's sometimes called, or the age of exploration, as it's sometimes called, which is also associated with this time period, this turn to modernity. And part of that story is, Christians had been nestled in Christendom in Europe and not known that there were other ways of thinking and believing, but because of this age of exploration, this age of discovery, they're now confronted with Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and native peoples in the Americas who don't believe the same things, and so they get a sense of religious pluralism, and so also we have that kind of thrown in the mix here. But the last thing I think I want to say about this this move to modernity is that we have this idea of the Enlightenment. I notice we had the Renaissance, the rebirth, and now the Enlightenment. This moving towards the light of science and reason. And part of this, you hear the story of Sir Isaac Newton and his description of the cosmos becomes, Isaac Newton's dates are 1643 to 1727. This becomes the basis of the mechanistic view of the universe, materialistic, mechanistic view of the universe, effectively disenchanting the world. The world is now drained of or stripped of, magic, of superstition, of, religious beliefs that can't be verified by scientific methodology.
And there's a sense in which now humans can fully understand the world. We're on the cusp of it almost. Reality will become fully knowable by us. Because look, Newton has been able to show that a huge range of phenomena can be explained, known, with a few simple laws, right? The three major laws of Newtonian mechanics. You can explain all this stuff going on in the world, and if that's all there is, then man, we've almost got a God's eye view on things, don't we? We're about to really understand everything,
and this allows for a move away from what comes to be referred to at this time as revealed religion. Revealed as in God reveals himself through something like the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas, to a kind of rational religion. What if we stripped away the superstition and the magic, what's left? What can we say about what can reason bring us to believe about God and the soul and the afterlife? And Locke engages in this and his the reasonableness of Christianity. That's John Locke. Um, so Episcopalians love to quote the poetry of George Herbert,
Mm.
but his brother Lord Cherbury um, is someone who is called the father of deism, because he basically says, well, if you strip away all of the pagan accretions to the basic Christian message, which you find is a rational religion that can be held by everybody, if you and in fact, if you strip away all of the accretions and superstitions connected with any of the major world religions. So now we've got this idea of religion as a genus level term with different species. If you strip it away, you find this rational religion at the core of all these religions. And he had five things that he thought made up rational religion. And essentially it's a kind of providential deism that still holds on to the idea of the immortality of the soul and an afterlife, but this is a moving away from revealed religion in that sense, and almost
And basing the religion entirely on what you can rationally know. I think that's the key thing. So in a sense, reason has been raised up to the level of ultimate authority, right? And it'll be as we go forward then that people felt, well, these ideas that the natural religious folks of the 18th century believed were rational aren't actually rational, but they keep with that same basic lens that reason is the heart of it, and to use reason is and have that be your authority in this thing that's supposedly shared by everybody in the world, is to be grown up, right? That's what it means to have matured and to become an adult. We've been talking, pretty much exclusively about Christianity here, but Nick, in college, I studied pretty in depth a German Jewish philosopher named Moses Mendelssohn, who was very much a Enlightenment figure, part of the Jewish Enlightenment. And this was his project, was to take natural religion, the rational religion, and kind of build Judaism on top of that. But you can see that the underlying thinking in his perspective is that there is this kind of shared natural religion that all people, if you just use your reason, you would come to. And then at the heart of that really is reason. That's the real divinity, if you will, in this perspective.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And exactly. This is not something just affecting Christianity. It's, though perhaps having the most effect. And we'll see that, I think, in later videos when we talk about some of this, there will be a discussion of how in more contemporary times about how, say, you'll sometimes hear people even now say the problem, and I'm not saying this, I'm saying this is what other people say. Some people will say the problem with Islam is that it never had a reformation.
Yes,
right?
yes.
It didn't go through these stages,
It never had an enlightenment, right? It never had to grow up and face the modern world or face reality as it actually is,
right,
and
or
kind of
have a nation state, impose that separation to suppress religious violence.
right, right.
Yeah.
I think the thing we want to say too about the Enlightenment in the 18th century is that this conflict between religion and science, perceived conflict, really gets ramped up, right, in the narrative. That this is a moment in which reason is really starting to push back hard against all superstition, dogma, and the corruptions of the church. And it may be worth sharing a quote, Nick, from Bertrand Russell, who 20th century philosopher, wrote a very famous book called Principia Mathematica on logic and mathematics. commented on all sorts of things, university professor, well regarded. Many of you probably have heard of him. And he has a book called Religion and Science that was from the mid 1930s. And he writes this, which I think very much captures the mindset of the 18th century. Religion and science are two aspects of social life, of which the former has been important as far back as we know anything of man's mental history, while the latter being science, after a fitful flickering existence among the Greeks and Arabs, suddenly sprang into importance in the 16th century and has ever since increasingly molded both the ideas and the institutions among which we live. Between religion and science, there has been a prolonged conflict. That quote, I think, very much summarizes what we've said up to this point. There was a dark ages, and before that was a kind of flowering of reason and science, but then it was extinguished. The candle was extinguished. The light was smothered, but then the light burst forth again, right? In the Renaissance and in the 1500s. And now it's in this struggle, this war with religion. Religion's trying to get back to where it was and push the light away, cover it. But the light is pushing harder and shining forth. And in some ways, the world is coming of age in the 18th century. The light is spreading throughout.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And and so we see this narrative of you know uh, reason and science must drive us, all of us, to question traditions and drive us to strip away the superstitions and unnecessary dogma of the past. Um, this history has finally come of age, and humanity has grown up.
Right.
Um, and and this has even meant that for some, the methodological atheism that's presumed when you're doing science, essentially the presumption, and that you must do when you're doing it, an experiment, that God isn't going to come in and mess with it, because there is no God, right? You've got to kind of say, I'm not worried about God intervening or miracles happening. That's a methodological atheism. Uh, Now becomes an attractive metaphysical position. There's just no God at all, um, and this seems to be, at least for some, it seems to be a natural outgrowth of this war that um, this war of ideology that Bertrand Russell was
Right.
referring to, between religion and science. Maybe they just can't even get along. Maybe they just can't even coexist peacefully, because the methodological atheism of science leads you to a metaphysical atheism, and religion's always going to be trying to pull you back. Uh, you know, every time I try and get out, they pull me back in. And, it's going to keep trying to pull you back into the darkness of superstition and magical thinking, and things that can't be.
And the kind of framework that we've been talking about here for the 18th century, the way that God is conceived, right, as a kind of as outside the immanent frame, maybe occasionally breaking in, um, hits God as a kind of rival causal agent, right, to the material world, to physical processes. So if you've adopted a methodological atheism, which basically just says, look, I'm looking for a physical explanation for this physical phenomenon, and your conception of God is that God is a potential rival claim and force, then if you say, well, look, I'm able to explain all these things without invoking God, it's very easy to then ask the next question, well, why posit the existence of God at all? And you can see, Nick, I think that that's very much rooted in how God is conceived. Yes, these individuals who were the deists and proponents of natural religion would have said they believed in God, but the way they conceived of God kind of laid the foundation for this very natural development. It reminds me of that quote from Laplace, where I think it was Napoleon asked him, where's God in this? And he says, I have no need of that hypothesis. It doesn't help add anything to my explanation.
So I'd say that's basically the story. That's basically the story that we've all kind of, in some sense, grown up with, heard in some form or fashion, or in bits and pieces. Those are the stories. It really might be a better way of putting it, that we've heard in some form or fashion in our education and our media. It's just in the air we breathe. I'm worried. I don't want us to break the record, which we might anyway, of how long our last video was. So
I think we're only at an hour and a half, Nick.
Okay.
So yeah.
What I'd like us to do now is to kind of change gears. I want us to actually get a little meta, take a step back, and look at this story or these stories. Not in depth, not look at their particulars, but just kind of look at them and notice some broad kind of aspects using categories given to us by Charles Taylor in A Secular Age that will help us think through some of what's going on here. One thing to note is that this is a master narrative, or these are master narratives or meta narratives, which means, in a sense, that they are stories that don't recognize that they're stories.
Right.
Anytime someone says, "You've got a myth, but I've got history," or that's just a story, but this is what really happened. It's not that person doesn't have a story too. It's that they don't see their story as a story. I'm hesitant to use the word myth because myth is a loaded word. It has a lot of baggage. It means different things in different contexts. But in a sense, you can say all we have are myths. That doesn't mean that's not making a statement about there being no connection to reality and the actual, that there are actual historical events and historical facts. That's not the point. The point is, how do you choose which ones to tell?
Right. We all have narratives, right? I mean, we all have narratives, and history is always a framing. How do you put the data, which are real facts, right? We believe in the world. How do we organize those? How do we make sense of them? What do we, in some sense, highlight? And then what do we discard as unimportant? Any historian will tell you that that's always a process. Historiography is part of what historians do. But that's not maybe as well known, right, in the wider society. And so it can be easy to think that what you think about how history developed is the history, right, is the reality. And these are other fictional interpretations. And then we might even use the word myths, which we just use to mean false in our society, right? You can just simply say that maybe there are different narratives, there are different ways of constructing the data, putting it together into a whole.
Right. The only reason why myth might be a helpful word is that if you take away the negative connotations and think about it as a story that helps us make sense of reality and our place in reality, the world and our place in the world, then these two are myths in that sense. But and in that sense, there's no way to not have myths or narratives. One way, really quickly, of thinking about this that might make it a little less abstract and a little more concrete is, let's say that you want to learn about a historical figure. And it could be Martin Luther King Jr. or it could be John Adams, So one way that you could do that, and let's say, like many of us, when do I have time to read? But I can watch something on TV while I eat my dinner, so I'll do that. So all right, so what are you going to watch? Well, let's say it's Martin Luther King Jr. You could watch a movie like Selma, which is a great movie, by the way, or you could watch a documentary on Martin Luther King Jr. Right? Similarly, if it's John Adams, you could watch the John Adams miniseries done by HBO, which is wonderful. I probably watch at least part of it every single year. I just think it's so great. But or you could watch a documentary on John Adams, right? Just not from the History Channel, because it'll probably say that John Adams learned everything he knew from aliens. But anyway, so you have these two ways, right? You can watch a fictional account that tries to portray the history, through this fictional story that nevertheless is attempting to be historically accurate, but it's still, it's a fictional story, right? With actors playing the parts and so on. And that anytime you tell a fictional story, in doing so, you're going to have to change things to fit the medium. Or you could watch the documentary. And I think the temptation is to see the documentary as just giving you the facts, whereas the movie is telling you a story. But in reality, the documentary is telling you a story too. And what the director of the documentary decides to include and not include, which pictures to show, or which historical sites to go to, how those are filmed, how the interaction of the historical figure, Martin Luther King Jr. or John Adams, how they interacted with their contemporaries, how that's, talked about, which scholars you talk to and include in your documentary. All of that is just as much telling a story as the movie or the miniseries.
Yes.
It's not as if one's telling a story and the other's not. They both are. But the difference is, I think, is that the documentary is sometimes not self-conscious about the fact that it's telling a story.
Right.
And that's what we're saying about history versus, myth or something like that, is that when you're telling narratives that are historical, particularly if they're master narratives like the ones that we just went through, they're stories that aren't, they're like documentaries. They're stories that don't recognize that they're stories.
Right.
But as soon as you do recognize that they are, then you can approach them critically,
Right.
and question whether or not they're telling a good story. Good as in accurate to the facts, but also good as in giving you an actual better understanding of what happened then and how it relates to you now. And so that
they offer a persuasive framing of the historical developments. I mean, that's the question we're asking in a sense always when we're doing history is, well, how did we get here? What was the process? And then the historian has to tell a story, right? Well, this is how we got here. And that story can often be told in multiple different ways. And how we tell the story shapes our perception of meaning and significance, and what forces were most important or weren't important, and so forth. I mean, as you were talking about documentary, Nick, the thought that jumped in my head, I thought about the documentary that Michael Moore did, Fahrenheit 9/11, which is a documentary, right? It's not presenting itself as a fictional account or anything, And one might find the narrative that's presented persuasive or not. But I think we would all recognize, because certainly Michael Moore recognizes, that he's telling a story, right? He's interpreting data in a very particular way. He's not making up any of that data. He's just interpreting it, right, in his way. Maybe that it's kind of an extreme example. Maybe that highlights really nicely, I think, the point that we're trying to make here. If you haven't seen that, then go out and watch it. You'll see.
That's a great example. So, master narrative is a story that doesn't realize it's a story. It is a bearer of our social imaginary. This is another Taylor term that we've already talked about a little bit. And the social imaginary is a lot like the sociologist, is it Peter Berger? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, Peter Berger's conditions of belief. If you think of, for example, Noam Chomsky and manufacturing consent, Chomsky's major point in that is that the media doesn't tell you what to believe or what to think, but it tells you what to think about. In other words, there might be two atrocities happening in the world simultaneously, but if your media, the media that you are that's available to you, is only covering one, that's the only one that you're going to have an opinion about. And if the media presents an issue as if there's only two sides, unless you're willing to do extra research and to think about it some more, which most of us are usually too tired after a day at work to do extra research on issues and think about them and make an informed decision, the media will present you with two options: yay or nay, thumbs up or thumbs down, and liberal or conservative, and those are the options you think you have. So it doesn't tell you which option you should believe, although we may have entered an age of media where you choose your media outlet and it does tell you which one you should believe or which one you should.
Well, this, Nick, I think that this is obvious probably to all of us if you simply think about the three major cable news networks. So I don't have cable at home, but I will listen to the three different networks during lunchtime sometimes when I'm going out to get lunch. And almost invariably now, they are all talking at exactly the same time. They're talking about completely different subjects. It may not be the case that they're fabricating facts or anything of that simple, but they are shining a light on very particular things and completely ignoring other things, right? And you are then left with the impression that this, if you're listening to, say, Fox News, this is what is really, really significant and important right now. And this is the set of issues that you should be thinking about. And then you turn over to CNN, it's a completely different set of issues. And that's, in a way, maybe that's what we mean by media bias. But of course, in a sense, this is always true, right? There is no such thing as unbiased media by definition, because to your point about Chomsky, they've got to decide what things are we going to even talk about, what things are even important. And they can't talk about everything, right? So how are those decisions made? Well, they're usually made by whatever social imaginary or background perspective that person or age or group has.
So to bring this back to specifically this story that we've been telling and looking at, so you can have an opinion about what's the role of the nation state vis-a-vis religion. And you can have different opinions about that, because our social imaginary presents that to us, that there's a thing called religion and there's a thing called the nation state, and the two have a relationship, and then you have an opinion about what the relationship should be about, how it should play out. What the social imaginary typically will not do is say, wait a second, is religion a good category at all? Right? You know, people, I've often found that when I'm talking about history to people, they have a hard time thinking outside of the nation state as the political configuration. And when you're talking about something like the Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire of the medieval period, these are not nation states. And if you think of them in terms of nation states, your history is not going to make sense. But because our social imaginary is formed by this notion of the nation state, it's sometimes very difficult for people to set that aside when they're looking at history. So that, I mean, that's just kind of one example. Another example is when we talked about the different options in our secular age with regard to believing in God. Either you're an atheist, or you're a deist, or you're an interventionist theist. That's because these are the options made available to us by our social imaginary. And again, thinking outside of those options takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of thinking that most people aren't prepared to do. You know, so really it often just comes down to even a much more simple, do you believe in God or don't you? Right? Is there a God or isn't there? That's what our social imaginary. And
can we say, Nick, though, that, you know, it's not just a question of like, well, we haven't done the research or we don't have the time, but it's actually really hard too. And that's part of what I think we want to capture here is, I think it was Taylor takes this phrase from Michel Foucault, I think, the concept of the unthought, right? It is something that is so basic and intuitive and foundational to how you look at the world that you can't, in some sense, even think it, or you struggle, you strain to even think of an alternative to it, or to even recognize that you're thinking that way. So I think part of what we want to say here is that this is actually really hard to do. And I think we would be naive to imagine that you and I are completely outside of our social imaginary. I mean, at least I certainly don't feel I am. And I think, you know, I wrestle with these unthoughts as much as anybody else. I'm trying to figure out what are my unthoughts and, you know, what's really kind of lurking behind the surface.
That's right. Yeah. So to give a kind of to help understand, because, you know, I know this is getting a little jargony, but you know, for example, to understand social imaginary and the unthought, if you know, if we use Taylor's idea of this ratchet point around 1500 in history, which corresponds with the story that we told. And you go back before 1500, he says, you know, before 1500, you know, it's hard for you to even imagine atheism, that there is no God, right? It's just part of your social imaginary that there must be a God, that nothing else is going to make sense if there isn't a God. And then the questions or the options are the nature of God, and you see theologians debate this. The unthought is connected to that, related to that, you know, in that if you know, because God exists, all the other stuff does too. Angels, it's a whole constellation of things that go along with the existence, the presumed existence of God, that it's hard to think outside of. So God exists, angels exist, you know, heaven and hell and perhaps purgatory exist. And that's why the Reformation is here at that turning point, because one of the first things that gets questioned is there a purgatory?
Yes.
And so that gets questioned, and slowly, when one part of the constellation of the unthought gets raised up to the awareness in the social imaginary for questioning, that's when other things can be questioned too. It drags the whole thing up. Did you?
I imagine that's something we'll want to get into in future videos, because I think that's a central part of Taylor's account of the story that he wants to tell, which in significant ways is different than the meta narrative that we've just been unpacking.
So Justin, the next part of this is, now that we've kind of talked about this social imaginary and thought, that is, Taylor refers to this as a stadial theory. I don't know if that's actually a word, but anyway, the idea is that history develops in distinct stages that you can, again, this is part of the story, the narrative that's being told. Is the idea that there are these stages. Even Taylor's own ratchet points in history are part of that stadial theory, or that idea that there are stages in history. So he's doing the same. He's telling a story too in a secular age. It's not he's not telling a story. He's trying to tell a different story. And we'll talk more about that. But this idea that history happens in stages, it seems to come up again and again. The Franciscan monk Joachim de Fiora, is famous or infamous for coming up with there was the age of the Father, which corresponds to the Old Testament, and the age of the Son, which corresponds to the New Testament. Now we're entering the age of the Holy Spirit. Many people have kind of used that kind of three-staged view of history. We kind of see it here. You have antiquity, and then you have the regression into the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. Which, by the way, I mean, it's very name, Dark Ages, of course, but Middle Ages and medieval, when we talk about the medieval period, that just means Middle Ages, right? I mean, it just means time in between.
These words, these phrases, by the way, were coined by Renaissance humanists.
Right.
They captured what they saw themselves doing.
That's right. And so we get Renaissance and Enlightenment as the, the birth of modernity, and even this word modernity, as if we've reached some new height. And of course, then what do you do with any kind of critical takes on the story of modernity? They all get lumped under a title called postmodernity or the postmodern, which we don't need to get into. But almost because what are you going to do? You've already got your three stages, so how are you going to distinguish? So we see that this story happens in these three stages, and the other part of it is that they are, and I think you've done a good job of lifting this up as we've gone along. There's subtraction stories and maturity stories, or stories of maturation. And we'll talk more about this, but subtraction stories, just in the sense of the stories are always about stripping away the accretions of superstition, stripping away magical thinking, stripping away the particularistic revealed aspects of religion to get to the kernel or the truth or the nugget. They're all about subtracting things that get in the way of the light of reason and the true kind of the truth at the core. That's what
left over is not something new. It's not as though something new or positive has been created, but it's that kernel that was buried deep in the rubbish, right? The diamond that was buried down there. There's a sense then in which there's nothing that has been created or developed. It's something that's been with us the whole time in this narrative.
Yeah, and going right along with that is that these are maturity stories, or stories of maturation. They're stories of growing up, whether it's history coming of age, or you know, humanity growing up, or even personally. And I'll talk about this some, I think, in the next video, because I think actually there are ways that we have, in a sense, ritualized this in our culture that are interesting and we can talk about. But
and along those lines, then we have to use the word progress, don't we, Nick? I
right,
mean,
yeah.
this is a story about progress, and you hear it in the way that we think about previous eras. You know, we imagine almost instinctively like we live in the best era, right? We wouldn't want to live 1,000 years ago. That would be horrible, because we've made so much progress, right? We're smarter in some sense. We're more rational. We're more thoughtful. We're more ethical, right? This is really, really important. And we have better values, better morals. We're better people. That's a big part of this story too, that I think we all imbibe living in this culture.
That's right. I mean, you know, and you'll hear this, for example, from many new atheists, you know, who will point out, you know, well, look at you know, look at the Ten Commandments. Is that really a great ethical? So, you know, I can come up with a better standard of ethics than that, you know, and you know, so there's, I mean, that's definitely a part of it, as you say, this progress in ethics and morals as we put aside these commitments, as we strip off these commitments to the confessions of revealed religion and their superstitions and such. We don't need a God to tell us
Right.
how to live, because we can actually come up with better.
Just using our reason, right? And if we de-shackle or unshackle, I should say, the reason that has been enslaved and held down, and let it flower, like we don't need any of that stuff, right? We can, and we will progress beyond what we ever were in the past. And this idea is maybe less powerful, has a less powerful hold on people today, but certainly in the 19th century, this idea was foundational in the Western world. That everybody thought in these terms almost. Not everybody, but the dominant view, the consensus view. And I think that's still with us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Darwin's actual idea of natural selection in evolution has nothing to do with progress.
Right. It's
And
not a moral claim at all. Yeah.
right. It has to do with what adaptations, what mutations allow you to or allow a creature, allow an animal to or anything, animal, plant, any living thing, to live long enough to reproduce. Right, is basically all it is. Right, and those mutations are the ones that are selected by nature. Which, by the way, we can't get into this, but the whole notion of nature, that there's this thing called nature, or the natural, is something else that goes along with our secular age. But that's not a story of progress, but it gets picked up by social theorists.
And becomes the foundation for the eugenics movement, right? Which actually developed in the United States, and certainly saw its awful fulfillment in, say, something like Nazism.
Yeah, and let's be clear, was still happening in Virginia until the 1970s.
Right, with sterilization efforts, yes.
Right. Well, anyway, that story of progress is what Taylor would call one spin on these narratives. There's another one that is that this is the story of the loss of enchantment, or of disenchantment. This, you know, there's and what goes along with that is this kind of longing for a lost time, when we were more closely connected to nature, and we believed that nature was alive with some elan vital, or with, you know, with some vital force, or with some with fairies, or whatever. I mean, there's almost this kind of romantic reaction. That's another spin on the. It's still the same story, still the same master narratives, but a different spin on it. In which case, we have to somehow get back to or revive a lost enchantment.
That's a response that you've, as you mentioned, you find with romanticism, and one that plays out particularly in art and literature and things of that nature. Yeah.
I think we really need to go ahead and wrap up there. We covered a
Yep.
lot, and we've laid the foundation for our next talk.
Yeah.
And so I'm really looking forward to getting into that. Thank you, Justin, for
Thank you, Nick, for a stimulating discussion as always, and look forward to talking about this during a Q&A on Wednesday.
Yep. Take care, Justin.
All right. Take care.
And you're here in the stillness, near me. I sense holy sweetness, calling my soul. Oh, it's restless and running, tired soul. Oh, it's restless till I find my rest in thee. And you're here in the stillness,